Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the virtual programming of the Lawrence Family JCC Jacobs Family Campus. My name is Ryan Isaac. I am the Director of Cultural Arts at the San Diego Center for Jewish Culture at the Lawrence Family JCC. And tonight's event is a joint presentation between us at the JCC and our friends at MOPA, the Museum of Photographic Arts. This is our first time joining forces, certainly an exciting one. Although we did, as the San Diego International Jewish Film Festival, screen, I think, 5 of our films just back in February. Feels like years ago right now, but it was only a couple months ago that we were down there. So it's nice to be back with our MOPA friends. Do want to remind everyone who's with us on Zoom, as now I think a lot of us are becoming Zoom experts. We can see many of you. It's nice to see you. Keep in mind that you can be seen. We have everybody muted. If there's a chance later for some Q&A, we can unmute, but also if there are questions or anything that arises during the program, feel free to use the chat function and I will be able to see that. I do also want to thank our underwriters, the underwriters of the 2019-2020 film season and the Arts and Ideas season. It is through the generosity of the underwriters that we are able to present events like this one tonight. So thank you to our underwriters. Our next event after tonight is coming Sunday at 6 p.m. with Mike Reese. Mike was a producer and showrunner, writer for The Simpsons. He was with them back in the day, and I can tell you one teenager who he influenced a great deal with his writing. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and I know a lot of people are. He's got about a 20-minute little talk / shtick that he is just rolling out about finding the funny during troubled times. So he's got some prepared material for us for that. And then afterwards, there'll be some Q&A. And he full well expects it to be Simpsons heavy. So comedy fans, Simpsons fans, make sure to come out for that. Tonight, however, we are very excited to have 2 people from the MOPA, Debrah Klochko, who is the Executive Director of MOPA, and Joaquin Ortiz, Director of Innovation. And it certainly seems like an interesting time to be innovating. I think we're all doing a little innovating at this point, discussing sci-fi, their lives through sci-fi and the influence of that. And I think we are ready to get things going. Joaquin and Debrah, would you like to talk a little bit about what is happening with you guys down at MOPA right now before we get rolling?
Well, first of all, Ryan, thank you for having us. And we're really very happy to be sharing this opportunity with you as we all move to an online engagement. And we find that working with you and the film festival has always been a real pleasure. So film is part of what we do, but right now we're here to talk about why at least Joaquin and I are the way we are because of, out of this world science fiction and how it influenced us. So I think maybe if we started with some slides. It's interesting too because Joaquin and I really are 2 different generations, and yet we spend a lot of time sharing our interests through science fiction. And I think it's really helped define a lot of the ways that we navigate this world. And while it's not The Simpsons, I think it's got its own humor and sorrow and strengths and adventure, and is a great way of looking at our world today and into the future. So if we start at the beginning, one of the ones I wanted to talk about was Flash Gordon. We're going to go back and forth a little bit between film and television, but Flash Gordon was actually produced in the 1930s and was meant to be seen in the movie theaters. And so granted, I'm much, I didn't see it the original 1930s. It was something that my father experienced when he would go to the films. But when I was growing up with television on Saturday, they would have this series available. And they did, they had 13, they called them chapters, not episodes. But as you can tell from the setting here, the production quality, as we look back on it with eyes from today's vantage point wasn't necessarily the highest. But I have to say, from my young perspective, I loved it. It was fun, it was engaging, and it took me places that I couldn't possibly go in any other way. So you had Flash Gordon, who was a Yale graduate, a polo star, and he was kidnapped by Dr. Zarkov, and as was Dale Arden, and they were sent off to Mongo to really try and stop the evil leader, Ming the Merciless, from destroying Earth. And it just got better from there. So Joaquin, I don't know if you have anything you want to say about Flash, but
well, no, I mean, of course I'm familiar with it, you know, but and I did watch it when I was very young and kind of catching it on that, but that's kind of what was interesting is when Deborah and I were talking about this and trying to figure out kind of where our journeys began in terms of getting into science fiction. What was surprising is that, you know, she was talking about Flash Gordon, and mine wasn't Flash Gordon, it was Star Wars, which is probably pretty common for people my age. But what was interesting about that is actually a lot of people don't realize that Star Wars was based on Flash Gordon. You know, George Lucas had grown up watching the Flash Gordon serials and chapters, and he was so into it that he, you know, wanted to create something like that of his generation, and so this was the result. And so even though Deborah and I may have come from different generations, the roots of what we're into is actually very similar in a lot of ways, and those influences kind of are the ties that bind back a lot of what the things that she and I really love about that, especially that idea of trying to see and explore these things that we can't see, you know. I think Deborah and I both are also voracious readers, which is probably pretty obvious. We work in museums, but at the same time, when we were young, we read. Yeah, yeah, mine's out of sight, but yeah, you know, we love to read, and so and when we were young, reading science fiction was a great escape from the world, and it was a wonderful way of seeing new things. And what Deborah and I both noticed when we were starting to talk about this, so you're going to see through this conversation, is that first, you know, the worlds, it was hard to create those worlds, you know, through this media at the time. Again, Flash Gordon or even Star Wars, you know, were these starting points. But at the same time, like, the storytelling is so rich within science fiction writing. And, you know, we've always hoped that that would become the thing that we would get to see. And so we're hoping to share with you how we've seen that evolve over time here. So.
And we're going to talk more about the storytelling element as well, because that's what really drives good science fiction. You can have all the best special effects in the world, but if you don't have a good story, you know, it doesn't stand the test of time, I think. So why don't we go to the next. So future past is an important one because, well, first of all, I'll say It Came From Beneath the Sea was probably the most influential film on my early life. And the reason was, it's 1955, and it was actually black and white. You're seeing a colorized version of it here. But this takes place with nuclear testing happening under the ocean. So the fear of the Cold War, of the H-bomb, of all of this is coming out in this particular film, where the radioactive fallout from the bombing has created a giant octopus. So for years, my family would travel. We lived on the East Coast. Every summer, we would go to Maine to a campsite where they would have an outdoor screening of a movie. Well, of course, in the summer, in Maine, it doesn't get late. It doesn't get dark till really late. So for 3 years running, every time we went there, I never saw the entire film because I would fall asleep through it. So I would always get to the point where it tore down the Golden Gate Bridge, but that would be, I'd pass out at that point. As an adult, I found it, I bought it, and loved it. But one of the things that I really like about it is it had a main female character, and she was a professor. And, you know, so that was a really interesting kind of role model to have. The other thing is, this was a Ray Harryhausen Dynamation production. And the octopus that you see here, it was also a very low budget film. And So he ended up making an octopus with only 6 arms instead of 8 because it was cheaper. But I'll tell you, you can still find it today online, and some of the scenes are great. The other thing that I really, really remember about it, after I finally saw the whole thing and they're attacking the Embarcadero in San Francisco, is there was a multiracial cast. They were all running from the monster. There were Asians, there were Blacks, there were whites, there were men, there were women. And it was just really impressed me at that time. It also scared me, you know, the radioactive octopus. I won't eat Japanese taco to this day for that reason and other reasons as well. But, you know, again, a powerful film.
And I just want to throw in Ray Harryhausen, you know, is an important name in the history of this kind of, you know, creative and science fiction cinema, and hugely influenced on me when I was young. You know, again, when I was younger, we didn't have cable. And so I got to, a lot of the TV I would watch was kind of like, you know, like late night TV, like through, you know, the airwaves, and they were still showing a lot of this kind of stuff. And so I was always blown away, and I'm still a huge fan of stop motion animation. And that's a lot, some of what we're going to be talking about a little bit too, is just some of the animation styles. But this was one of those early progenitors, and he was hugely influential in sci-fi. He did a lot of science fiction films and these sort of like kind of more earth-based films that are science fiction too, but you know, they did space and he did monsters. But a lot of you are probably familiar with his visual style and have seen it over the years, and it was one guy who really drove that for like 20-30 years or so. And so that was also hugely influential. I was so excited when Debrah chose this film because it's just such a neat film, and it's so to watch it come to life. And at the time there wasn't a lot outside of that, you know, that you didn't see. That's how the stuff was being brought to life at the time. But that was influential even on Star Wars when you look at some of what they did there and the stop motion they did in that film.
So if we go to the next one, another one that was I really really liked a lot came out of England, and it was Fireball XL5. And the XL name came from oil, motor oil, and the 5 was thrown on because it just sounded better to the creators. And it was a husband and wife team, Jerry and Sylvia Anderson, that created this approach of using these fairly large marionettes, and they called it super marionation. So it was super marionette animation, and it was an homage to Ray Harryhausen's Dynamation, his stop motion animation. And these were people that, so this was science fiction. I mean, they were out there in space, and they were part of an interplanetary team that was, you know, really protecting the solar system. And they came alive, even though they were pretty funky even then, but a lot of fun to really watch. Another one that came right after that was, of course, Thunderbirds. And the Thunderbirds was, it was an organization. The premise was an organization on a secret island that was meant to protect the world from all kinds of dangers. And one of the things, they were interested in humanitarian ideals. There was a family that was called, let me just look at it, the Tracys, and they were part of an international rescue team. And the father, Jeff Tracy, had 5 sons, and they were named after the Mercury 7 astronauts. So that there was Scott, John, Virgil, Gordon, and Alan. So named for Scott Carpenter, John Glenn, Virgil Grissom, Gordon Cooper, Alan Shepard. But they were still puppets, and they were still flying. And but Future Past is about, you know, if you go back to the 60s and look at how they were imagining the future. And you can see that there's just, it's about transportation. It's about fancy vehicles and rockets and you know, communication across long distances with small devices. So they were really looking at a future that is a little bit antiquated, but still a lot of fun.
Yeah, and similarly, I saw Thunderbirds when I was young. I wasn't familiar with Fireball until Debrah and I started talking for this presentation. But Thunderbirds definitely was an amazing show to me when I was young because, again, it brought those worlds to life in a way that you wouldn't expect. And for considering they were using string puppets, marionettes, the things that they were able to accomplish with all of it was amazing. And again, the way they were able to bring those worlds to life was exciting. But again, some of the storytelling was kind of cheesy. This show especially was more for kids, and so they're great shows, but as you start to age, you start to rethink about kind of what are you tied to, what are your favorites, those sort of things, and hoping to see some of what you saw in your imagination.
But I thought that was really important to talk about, especially with what Joaquin is going to look at with anime, because for me this was the early animation. I mean, so they were crude. They were also fairly racist. They were not PC. But again, we're all naive at that time. It's only as we look back that, the kind of the yellow fear in Flash Gordon with the Chinese-esque Ming the Merciless. And there's an Asian character in Thunderbirds, 2 Asian characters. So there, and the names and all of that are a little bit challenging. But as a naive young person, what you're really seeing at that moment in time are these kinds of interracial casts, even if they're puppets. So I think, though, we're ready to go on to the really inspirational one.
Which is a big turning point for both you and I, even though it might have happened in somewhat different times.
Yeah.
Whoops.
So, Star Trek. I love Star Trek. And when it came out, boy, the universe changed for all of us, because not only were they taking us to places that we had not gone before, they had an inter-alien crew, but they had an Earth that was much more ideal than our present Earth. You didn't need money. You didn't need, there was sort of this government, and space, the final frontier, was really, really very important. One of the things that's interesting to me is that the pilot for Star Trek actually had a completely different captain. And the original pilot was called The Cage, and it had a commander, it had Captain Christopher Pike, who was leading the Enterprise. And the pilot ended up being, NBC was who they made the pilot for, and they rejected it because it was too intellectual and too sexual. So in this rare instance, they were able to go back and do a second pilot. And the actor who played that, Hunter was his last name, decided not to sign up for the next pilot. So he lost out on a lifetime of fame and fortune. And you have William Shatner playing James Kirk. The other change, if you go back and you look at The Cage, which is available online, they have Spock. And I went into shock because I rewatched it in preparation for this, and he's smiling in one place. And I thought, oh my gosh. So Spock had emotions, and it was a female number 1 who was more emotionless. And so, but then with the next one, we end up with a really great, called The Man Trap. We end up with the Star Trek that we know and love. Be up, Scotty.
And I mean, the show was so progressive, as Deborah's mentioning about some of these things that drew her to these kind of more, multicultural casts and more representation. This was like at the forefront of that during its time. It was the first television show to ever show an interracial kiss. you know, and I think we sometimes forget about that because it is campy and it is cheesy, but it also was really progressive at the time. Like even Debrah saying about the kind of government it presented within its storyline, you know, it was really pushing a lot of ideas that were that were strange during that moment, and that's part of the reason it was so successful, is because it was so ahead of its time, you know. And so I think you're seeing that, you know, 50s and 60s television was a huge influence on me as a child, and so I watched lots of Star Trek when I was a little kid, you know, over the broadcast airwaves. But the big shift for me, of course, was then when you know, going into my, you know, my teenage years and those things was Star Trek, the Next Generation, because this was kind of the updating of all those ideas. And as much as I loved and still do love the kind of lo-fi aspect of some of these older shows, this finally started to make it feel like, oh my God, this is real. And, you know, like they can really do some really advanced things here. The makeup, the effects, you know, the ability to visit some of the worlds. It seemed so much more real all of a sudden. What was also really interesting about it is the storytelling was a continued advancement of what we were seeing. There was really thoughtful, as Debrah's already saying, Star Trek was always a very thoughtful show, but they brought so much more of that here, or continued that legacy, while also having kind of more long-term and interesting developments around characters and long-term storylines and things like that, which to me was really new at the time. I wasn't used to that. I wasn't, at the time I actually couldn't watch it very easily because we didn't get the station actually very easily at my house. And so I never really got to see the kind of fleshing out of all the characters. And as an adult, I've gone back and rewatched a lot of these, including the original series, because I'm a huge fan. And realize how in-depth they were, really how much they were building these characters, giving them episodes, having you to kind of really get in depth with them. And I just wasn't used to that when I was a teenager. I was so used to the brief episodic kind of Flash Gordon-y kind of stuff, or the kids cartoons, where it was just more of, you know, it was just a little one-off. You know, every episode was its own little piece, but there wasn't a bigger story at play. You just kind of was the same thing every week. It's like a sitcom almost, you know, every week is the restarting of the same storyline, you know, then they're going to learn the same lessons and, you know, that sort of thing. You were seeing something different starting to transition here, and that had started in the 60s with the original Star Trek.
Well, they were developing characters, and then they were bringing in extended characters, and sometimes they would repeat. And so it really was about relationships as much as it was about adventuring into outer space. And it, you know, there were a lot of moral storylines that were dealt with as well. So it really did have, I think, a powerful impact and influence. And that's why it's still popular today.
And coming back to what, you know, I was saying earlier about with Debrah and I being readers, I mean, this is where I think both of us started to experience shows that we're dealing with some of those really intellectual ideas that you find in science fiction. You know, it wasn't just about space and adventure and, you know, getting the bad guy. It was about exploring some of those topical things that sometimes get into moral and ethical realms. And so that was really, it was interesting to see the ideas, but also, again, the characters and how they had to relate to those ideas, you know. And so there was just such a neat step for a lot of us, you know, who were experiencing this at the time.
Okay. The Weird and Wild.
So I created this, I gave this title because as a film buff, the late 1970s were super weird. There was a lot of weird stuff going on. You know, there was a lot of experimentation in the 60s that led to the 70s being kind of like the Wild West of people doing a lot of new things that were unexpected. And Debrah chose one that I think is an excellent example of this.
So Quintet, which came out in 1979, and I was interested in it for a couple of reasons, but one, it was Robert Altman, the director, and I had been watching a lot of his films at that time, Nashville, Three Women, and of course when Quintet came out with Paul Newman, which is one of these ones, like It Came from Beneath the Sea, that references a nuclear holocaust as the reason for what's transpired. And so you have a world that's entirely frozen, encased in snow, beautiful shots. And the actual, a lot of the review and the criticism of it is that it was fairly obtuse. But what I really liked was the atmospheric the film, and because they filmed in real cold and real snow. And it happened that the location was the former Winter Olympics site in Montreal that was from '68, so from about 10 years before. And so the actual cold and was real and part of the problem. And Quintet is not only a game that they play, but it's a a religion that is presented, a belief system that is presented as part of that film. And what happens is, you know, this is, there are other films that are much more contemporary that remind me or seem to be influenced by Quintet, and one is Snowpiercer, though I know that started off as a manga.
Yeah,
Manga.
it's a, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, but why don't we go to the next one?
Yeah, and just as a note for all of you out there too, Deborah and I were talking about this earlier today, that we could have gone on a real long side tangent about like weird 1970s obtuse abstract science fiction films, because we're way into that stuff too. But that was going to be a long tangent. We decided to stick with some of the more fun stuff we like. But if you're ever interested, you can always reach out to us after this, because we have lots of things that we'd still like to share.
We'll save that one for part 2 of this.
Yeah,
I guess so. Yeah, right. So my turning point, even though I didn't see this in the 70s, by the way, obviously. But sadly, what's strange is I saw this film when I was around like 8, which is way inappropriate. It's a film for adults. It's not for children. But my parents didn't know that at the time. You know, it's a cartoon. It must be for kids. It is not. It was directed by this guy named Ralph Bakshi, who did a lot of films in the 70s, including Fritz the Cat and a few other much more adult-oriented sort of animations at the time. And this was his sci-fi fantasy film. And it actually really explores a lot of interesting ideas about, you know, the terror and horror that happened in World War II and these other things. Again, kind of a post-apocalyptic kind of film, which is a common theme in science fiction. But this was a big turning point for me when I was young, because obviously as a kid, I loved cartoons, but suddenly I saw that cartoons could engage with topics that were much, much more adult. You know, even though it was probably a little not age appropriate for me at the time. But the other thing is again, you know, I was so interested. I wanted my imagination to come to life. I mean, every science fiction fan wants that. You want to not only see it come to life, but hope someday experience that. I mean, both Deborah and I talk all the time about we hope that we wish we live into that future, right? You know, because we want to see it for ourselves. And so we're saying that though. I'm saying that though because like this film also brought a lot of that to life for me, and it made me realize like animation, like oh, you can do anything with animation, you know, like any world can come to life in animation. And so it started a lifelong love affair with the possibilities of animation, and that started to continue for me into the future, and it was a passion for me within the science fiction realm. So to kind of follow up on that, when I became a teenager, a friend of mine exposed me to a film that is highly well regarded, which is Akira, which came out in 1988. And so the funny thing is actually, the first time I saw this film, I actually didn't get to watch all of it. I was at a friend's house, and he was a huge fan, and his parents were pretty liberal about what he was able to watch. And so, you know, we were in our mid-teens, and so he tried to show this to me. In the beginning of it is extremely violent, and I was at the time not used to that sort of thing, so I was utterly shocked. And his mom came through, and she was like, "Maybe Joaquin shouldn't watch that." And so she made him shut it off. But I did see it soon afterwards, and it blew me away. And it's still known today as one of the landmark, not only science fiction films, but also, of course, anime films that really, you know, stepped up the genre and made people see that it wasn't just something for just kids in Japan, but it was really an art form unto itself. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I highly, highly recommend it. I know a lot of people feel a little uncomfortable watching Japanese animation because it's not really for everyone. People feel like it's a cartoon, but this film really, I think, brings a lot of those ideas together in a way that's extremely meaningful. And especially when you think about 1988, what they presented at that time really tied together a lot of ideas that you would have seen in Blade Runner and a lot of other things that were already coming out. But it did it in an animated way, and it tells a very, very interesting story about kind of where we're headed and what's most important in life. Is it technology or is it the people around you? And so, but I also want to say, Deborah and I also collect memorabilia from the random things. One of my biggest recent purchases is the Akira soundtrack as a reissue on vinyl. I'm a big vinyl lover. My vinyl collection's on the other side of the camera. You can't see it. The soundtrack is mind-blowingly different too. And there's a really interesting, some videos out there about how they made the soundtrack to kind of bring together an atmosphere that was so different from the time. And it's different from other kinds of soundtracks you might hear for a science fiction film. It was actually very organic. It was taiko drum players and these Japanese singers. But the way it gets put together, it really brings out the atmosphere of the film. So you have these amazing, astounding visuals, and some of which have not only influenced other anime, obviously, but have influenced American films as well. And they've been working for years to bring this to live action somehow. But the soundtrack also just brings that atmosphere to life. And so it's a film I highly recommend. And this was, again, a further turning point for me of realizing that Japan was really engaging with some of those really in-depth ideas. And that was something that I really wanted to explore even more.
So talk to me though about some of your interest in anime, because is it that it's unlimited in terms of what they can do? Because now they have special effects that they can do anything.
And I think that's what you and I are kind of discussing as we get it deeper and deeper into this is, and when I was growing up, you know, the only way to see some of these really mind-bending realities, which is another one that was influential on me at that time, was this show called Aeon Flux that I'll talk about in a sec. That was one of those places where you couldn't see some of those things unless somebody drew it, you know. And you and I both agreed that sometimes the special effects of the time couldn't always bring it to life, you know. They were using puppets, or it was more simple rudimentary animations, or you know, they use these green screens in the background to bring some of those things to life. Star Wars for me was a big change because the world seemed so real and tangible, and the story was very engaging for somebody my age, you know, because I was young when I got involved in it. As I was getting older and engaging with more teenage concepts and ideas and turning towards adulthood, I wanted to see things that reflected that, but I still wanted to see that world recreated. And Aeon Flux was one. So this is actually not a Japanese show; it's an American show. It was on MTV in like the early '90s, it's kind of. It's been a little bit forgotten about now. There was a live action movie that I do not recommend. But this show, again, was exploring a lot of those topics, ideas. This show is a lot of, especially about what it means to be free and about freedom of thought and things like that. It's about a repressive society where this character here is kind of fighting against this very repressive government that's trying to separate and dehumanize people. And that was like, for me as a teenager, that was mind blowing, because that was the kind of stuff I was reading in books, you know, but I wasn't seeing that within some of the shows I was watching. And because the science fiction in the like early '90s, some of it was kind of, you know, I think Debrah would agree. The early '90s were not a great period for science fiction on TV and some of the movies. But these animated shows brought it to life, and there was storytelling happening and ideas happening that I wasn't seeing. And there's going to be as I get later into this, there's going to be a show that really was a huge influence on me that really solidified all those beliefs. But this show was a big deal to me. And also I want to say that it came about and has its style because there was, so the director of this show and the creator of this show, Korean American, but had been exposed to Japanese animation. And so, you know, in the 80s, and so in the 90s, he created this show, and MTV happened to be this odd platform for that, where they were experimenting and had these late night shows about kind of odd animation. So this was like some one-off animations he did for that show, and they turned it into a whole series that was on for multiple years, as you see. And so, and it was really different at the time, and it really shocked me because it reminded me of some of the Japanese animation I had seen, but it also made me realize that there was more out there to that. And it wasn't just the Japanese scene, but the influence of Japan was already starting to spread even as early as this time.
Okay. So Future Imperfect. This is where, for me, it gets really interesting because, as we mentioned, Star Trek, it was an idealized Earth, an idealized society. And after that, it all went downhill because these other shows that start coming out, like Earth 2, they were always escaping from. And so Earth 2 is at a time where humans have pretty much left the surface of the planet and they're living in space stations. But what happens is a number of the children that are being born on these space stations end up with an illness that's called the syndrome, which means they can't walk, they can't talk, and it's eventually going to kill them. So one of the reasons there were a number of reasons I like this show. One is the woman who led the journey from the space station was a woman, a billionaire who set up this plan to colonize this new planet that hopefully would find a solution for these very sick children. The other thing is it turns out that the planet had intelligent life, and there were at least two main species. And one of them references, it made references to our ideas of our idealization of Native Americans. The Turanians were an intelligent species that communicated by telepathy, but they could also physically move through the earth. So you'd see them sort of pop up out of the ground or move through, but they were also the solution, the cure for the illness, the syndrome. So convoluted story, they find out that they're being sabotaged. They get rid of the bomb. They take this long journey, this 2-year journey to their new planet. They crash land, and it's about they're trying to get to the location that they had selected and what happens to them as a group, and adjusting to a new planet. But a woman in charge, I really, really enjoyed that. And again, it's back to that kind of pioneer existence that is very, very telling, and how they're going to deal with these races that they find in this new world. So Earth 2, I really, some of the acting was a little funny, but the rest of it, again, it was ensemble. It was about the storyline, creating the relationships, and also still having to deal with the controls from planet Earth. And because Earth was going to take over this planet, watch it to see what the story is. So I think we could go to the next one.
Well, I was going to chime in. I loved Earth 2, but it also was reflective of something that was happening during this period. Is you had these great shows exploring really interesting ideas. They had good characters. They were a little low budget, like Debrah said. The acting wasn't always that great, but they were really engaging for people like us. They would only be on for 1 season. They never got renewed, which was really hard on people like us because we got engaged by these shows, but they just never had the viewership. And you're finally starting to see those stories and those ideas that you want, and it's just not there. Like they just disappear after a season. And a lot of times they would end on cliffhangers, which was really disappointing because you'll never see more Earth 2, unfortunately. But it's a great show, especially at that time. It was so phenomenal. It was so different. And for me, what happened in the late 90s is I got exposed to a show that really rechanged how I was thinking about that stuff. Because I was looking for the storytelling, and this show completely changed it for me. It's of course considered a classic for those of you who know much about Japanese animation. Neon Genesis Evangelion is the name of it. And so in the late 90s, actually, I was in college, and I was the librarian for UC Santa Cruz's Japanese Animation Club. And so at the time, this is kind of an interesting aside, Japanese animation was not widely available at that time. It was really hard to get your hands on. It was very rarely sold here in the United States. And so the way to really get it was through what they called fan subs. And so what it was that people would record the shows and then make VHS copies where, dedicated fans had editing machines where they could put English subtitles over these shows so you could see them that way. And so, by the way, I still watch animation strictly in Japanese with subtitles because of my early exposure to this. Because there was no real dubbing at the time. You couldn't buy stuff where there was no companies investing in that. Whereas today, you can open up Netflix, Hulu, any of these streaming platforms. There's even a whole streaming platform called Crunchyroll that's all Japanese animation. But the only way to get exposed to it at that time was to trade tapes and make copies of these tapes. And I got lucky enough to be the tape master, to be the librarian, and have the huge box of tapes. Master. Yeah. And so I got to have all the tapes. And so I got to watch all these shows that I would have never had access to. And this was the one. Everybody at the club and all of us at the time, this was the show. And it was so advanced for what you were seeing. And it's a fascinating background because the creator of the show suffered from a lot of depression. And so what he wanted to do was create a Japanese giant robot show, which is a long history in Japanese animation and in live action stuff, sort of like Godzilla TV show sort of things like that. But he also wanted to reflect all these very personal experiences that he was having because he was writing it and creating the show while he was suffering from this very existential depression. And so the show is reflective of this kind of existential crisis he was having. And so this main character and these other main characters kind of embodies these different facets of himself and this crisis that he's going through, while also talking about kind of like again, this kind of coming Armageddon sort of thing, which I know is dark to talk about during this time. But it's fascinating how it starts to bring all that together. And again, similar to what I was talking about before about the human relationships that we need more so than the technology and other things. And so this show, again, was just masterful to me. It's hugely influential. And if anybody of you are ever interested in checking it out, it is now on Netflix. They purchased the rights for it, and it's going to be there, I think, indefinitely, as far as I know. And I think they have a new dub of it, an English cast that's supposed to be pretty good if you don't like to read subtitles, because I know some people don't. But this show was really mind-blowing to me at the time. One of the key things that Debrah was talking about, we keep on bringing up, is that for me also, this was tied back to the storytelling thing. The show is 26 episodes, and then it has 2 movies that wrap it up. it was all storytelling. It was all focused on the storytelling, because again, it was about this kind of exploration of this existential crisis through these characters. And so it was very character driven, but so it wasn't episodic. It wasn't just this week this thing happens and then next time a new thing happens. It was a much wider and bigger story that involved all these characters and all these ideas, which reminded me of what I used to read when I was growing up. And like Debrah and I are saying, you weren't seeing a lot of that. I suddenly was exposed to this media through Japan, and I said, oh my God, some people are doing bigger stories like that. It's not just like some of these other shows where it's just week by week by week, but it's actually one huge story where I watch like a novel, 26 episodes that bring all that together. And so I didn't know that people could do that at the time. And I started wondering, how come people don't do this here? Why is it that the science fiction that I'm exposed to on TV here is just this kind of week by week sort of thing, you know? Sure, there's these great movies, but they're only 2 hours. And this is like 26 episodes, about 30 minutes. You're talking about like, this is probably about 12 hours long. It's like a 12-hour movie of great ideas and concepts and things that I'm really attached to. Why am I not seeing that here? And what Debrah and I started to find is that started to change. Another film that we wanted to talk about briefly, I'm going to throw out here just as a quick one. I'm not a huge fan of The Matrix, actually, but I wanted to talk about The Matrix real briefly, just because the directors of this movie, the Wachowskis, have outrightly stated the massive influences of Japanese animation on their decisions on how they made these films and why they made these films. And so it was interesting to me at the time, having come out of watching things like Neon Genesis Evangelion, to see a film that was embracing that also and seeing those influences here. And I know Debrah has some thoughts about Matrix as well.
Well, I actually love The Matrix, and I, and again, it really reflects on the changes that were going on in our real world, in terms of the internet, of new technologies, and this kind of what it really meant. If you look at the authors like William Gibson and what he's dealing with, this was the visualization of what he's writing about, and then the end of it, which is the fact that they're just really food for the aliens, made it even better, that it wasn't real. So it has a power and a visual sensibility that I think was really, really strong. And I hadn't seen anything, and Keanu Reeves is just gorgeous anyway. So that made it really easy for me. So
I just wanted to throw out there, because I'm going to the next slide that's related to the Matrix, but for any of those of you who might be a little bit sensitive, the next slide is from something related to the Matrix, but it refers to a historic Vietnam War image that it may be a little bit of a trigger for some people. So I just wanted to say that just in case, because we know sometimes people are a little bit sensitive to some of these things. So I'll just give you a sec if you want to tune out, to give you a moment here, or just to look away. But so moving on to the next slide. So what's interesting to me about The Matrix, though, is that they created as a sidebar, because The Matrix was this giant multimedia event sort of thing, that started with the first film and having this website called What is the Matrix and all these different things going on. And when the success of the movie happened, they kind of expanded into almost like an empire around the Matrix with the two other films that we're familiar with. But they also created a video game that was part of the storyline for the Matrix movies. And then also they created this thing called the Animatrix, which was about, I think, 6 to 8 short films that were animated films that explained backstories and more, it gave more context and parts of the stories for the Matrix universe. And what they did is, because of the success, they were able to, at this point, ask directors, Japanese animation directors who they were influenced by, to direct some of the segments for this. So that you were seeing this direct tie. Now, not all of it's Japanese animation. Only like 2 or 3 of them are out of the whole thing. Some of them are computer animated and other stuff. But you could, again, see how they were bringing all those ideas together. So for me, like, that's not only was that the visual style washing up, but also some of that storytelling was starting to now come. These bigger, wider narratives, these much larger arcs that were starting to happen, even in the films themselves. So again, I'm not an avowed fan of The Matrix, but I thought it was so interesting that they were willing to take so many big risks and try to tie all that stuff together. And you don't see that very often. And so I said this, the classics of the 2000s, because Debrah and I both have some stuff here, but especially I know some of these shows are hugely culturally influential, and so let's just jump into a really good one. Sorry, I forgot what slide I had next. This is me on my mistake. This is another Japanese animation that for me in the 2000s was hugely influential. It's based on a movie that came out in the 90s called Ghost in the Shell. And the movie is great for those who watched it. But this was a TV series they had for a couple of seasons. And the TV series, similarly to some of these things we're talking about, was really in depth about exploring really interesting ideas in sci-fi about how technology is going to affect our future. And it made it feel very real. So for instance, just before this, Ryan and I were talking about, along with Debrah, we're talking about, some of these recent Zoom bombings that are happening with some of these events and things like that. In this show, in the early 2000s, they were talking about, like, if you had a cyberized computer brain, that means somebody could hack it. And what did that mean? Could you change people's behaviors? Could you change what they see and believed? Those were, again, those things that I was reading about in books, and nobody was even addressing that sort of stuff, while still couched again in a much bigger storyline that talked about some of these really interesting issues. And so I loved the show. And for me, it was this continuation of a lot of these really interesting ideas. And actually, I didn't realize until right before we did this, last week, Netflix released a new version of this that's 3D animated. I've heard it's not very good, unfortunately. I haven't had a chance to watch it, but you can see the continued influence of this particular storyline and how it's also had a wider effect. And then for me on this one as well, there was what's interesting to me now, kind of wrapping up some of my thoughts about Japanese animation, is that there's this new studio called Studio Trigger, because that's how a lot of Japanese animation stuff works. Is there's directors, but it's a lot of times these studios that drive these kind of new ideas and exploration. And so Studio Trigger released this Japanese animation series in 2007 called Gurren Lagann. And what's funny about it is that it plays up a lot of the typical anime stereotypes, some of which are bad. You see the giant-breasted woman here, which is highly problematic, and is a big part of a lot of, unfortunately for my generation, male sci-fi fascination. Is very sexist, unfortunately. At the same time, what's interesting about the show is they started to question some of those anime tropes as well, and they've continued to do this through some of their newer series and movies. In this one, what I found so fascinating about it is, I was telling you, I love Japanese robot series, and Evangelion was a huge influence on me at the time when I saw that. For Gurren Lagann, they started to make fun of that idea. And so one of the things is that in the early part of the show, this main character that you see here at the front gets a little tiny robot that he gets control over. By the end of the show, the robots keep growing and growing and growing, that the robot is literally the size of a galaxy. And at that point, you can tell it's a joke. Like they think that anime is funny, even though they're making anime. So it started to become like this inside sort of thing where you actually start to see the medium of anime starting to question and starting to challenge and criticize in a fun and interesting and entertaining way, criticize its own norms and tropes, and started to break those down and make you rethink about them and tell new stories in new ways, in unexpected ways. There's a lot of twists and turns to the show that I never expected. When it was recommended to me, I assumed it was going to be the same as what I'd always seen. And these guys are now taking all that and breaking it apart and re-putting it back together in all these new ways. And so I really like that because unfortunately for me, Japanese animation has really hit like a flat spot, whereas there was a lot of innovation in the 90s going into 2000s. In the 2010s, it's become pretty stale. It's kind of started to fall back on the same tropes, like what Debrah and I were talking about with some of this older media. And it gets boring. It's just not as engaging as it used to be. But there are some people out there who are really trying to push the agenda, push some new ideas, and even question what is Japanese animation itself.
Hey.
Sorry, I thought we were going to jump into this first. Sorry about that, Debrah.
So Firefly had one season, and they did make a film called Serenity afterwards. But I have to say, Wild West in outer space. And the basic storyline is that we're 500 years in the future, and many planets have been colonized, but the level of colonization is really rough and low. It's dirt poor, basically. But what's fascinating about the stories that they create is these really about the characters, about the Wild West aspects, and there are no aliens. There are no artificial creatures and beings, really. So what makes it interesting is here they are going through space, but they're really trying to create a family. And so their interactions among the crew and the places that they go, and the dialogue is really well done. There's so much humor. in the story that it just keeps your attention. And they're definitely a mixed group of characters, from a professional prostitute, a whore, but it's, she went through training. It's considered a skill and a that's acceptable, to a fallen soldier who lost in the war and is really just trying to make his way throughout a very challenging universe and living really day to day. But again, you may have some things to say about Firefly as well.
Well, I have a question for you, because
yeah.
I always see Star Wars as having a lot to do with Firefly in terms of that kind of, because George Lucas was definitely tying back into like westerns, but also samurai films, because there was a lot of that cross-cultural conversation in the 50s and 60s between western samurais and kung fu films, and it feels to me like Firefly kind of picked up and like took that to like the next level. So, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. Maybe it's just me.
Well, I would definitely say that there's an element of the kind of kung fu, because one of the characters in it is this young, brilliant, but very damaged girl named River, who actually was trained and conditioned to be this incredible killing machine. And she, but again, it's you don't have the distractions of all of the kind of quirky aliens that you do in Star Wars.
Yeah.
And so again, that, and the Western side of it is much more obvious. There are horses, they're riding horseback. Look at the way they're dressed. They've got guns at the holsters, and they just act and look in that kind of Wild West fashion. And they're stealing and they're robbing trains, and the trains may be sort of modern kinds of trains, but they're really depressed worlds that don't have the kind of, the robots and the modern things that they had so much of in Star Wars.
That's interesting too, though, you say that, because like with Matrix, like they were also heavily influenced by kung fu. Actually, on the Matrix, they brought
very
in
much.
This very famous fight choreographer from Hong Kong, who's done a number of different films and been very influential there. But you're right, that all that stuff was kind of spilling into 2000s. I never put those things together, but this was only 4 years after the Matrix, and so, but there's a lot of cultural ties within this show that aren't. It's not your typical sci-fi show. It's an adventure show. It's fun, and that's why it's had so much popularity. But again, similar to what we were mentioning a moment ago, it got canceled after one season, what's strange is the fan base is huge now, for a show that now is 17, 18 years old now, the fan base is larger than it's ever been. So, and
what's interesting too is the film that came out of it actually ties together so many of the threads that you had in the original film, in the original TV series, and kind of brings it to a very powerful conclusion. That is, and that's probably why I keep saying I don't like the film as much, but mostly because it brought a lot of things to an end, but also started a whole new beginning. Yeah. So, but yeah, Firefly, it's really good dialogue, really good dialogue. So I think we need to keep moving. Defying Gravity. Defying Gravity, again, is one of those that got canceled way too early and left you hanging in a way that was completely unacceptable. But it lasted one season, 13 episodes, and it follows 8 astronauts that are trained and then are going on a journey of the solar system over a period of 6 years. And this is a story that's told back and forth in time, so through flashbacks and taking you forward. And there's an alien influence that's part of it, the beta, which you don't find out about till much later. That is kind of part of what they're searching for. There's, of course, the tragic hero who was on an earlier Mars mission, which was connected to securing one of these objects. And they had to leave 2 of the people on the ground, and one of them was someone he was in a relationship with, and that kind of marred them and marked them. as they're helping train this new generation that's going to continue on this journey. But I thought it was really well done, and again, great storyline, great interrelationships develop as they go through training, as they again deal with a mission that they think is one thing, but in reality turns out to be something very, very different. And if you're interested in fractals, they play a pretty interesting part in the film at one point. But we only get to one planet. Okay.
So bringing it up to today, I mean, I think Debrah and I agree, though, that we're living in this kind of like great golden age for a lot of this stuff, where we're now seeing not only the special effects improve, so we see all those worlds that we've always been dreaming of, but the storytelling is magnificent in a lot of these great new shows. So here's Debrah's first choice.
And I know we've been taking up a lot of time, so I'll kind of go through these quickly. But Defiance takes place in a future where you have 7 different alien races that are competing for life and survival on the planet Earth, to the point where they've transformed it. And so it's an Earth that we don't recognize anymore. And again, that Wild West, no holds barred, saloon kind of existence, but with these aliens. And so it's about good and evil, right and wrong, and those kinds of relationships. And the visuals are really fascinating in this, and the interspecies relationships play a really big part of this, not just in a sexual sense, but in a father-daughter sense, and in a whole different way of looking at a world that isn't the world we thought our future would be by any means.
Something I forgot about with this show, by the way, just back in relation to what we were talking about, the Matrix and it being kind of multimedia oriented. This show also had like a companion video game. I had forgotten about that, and it wasn't something I ever played, but I think that's fascinating that, again, some of those ideas are still lingering and people are trying to do some of those multimedia sort of experiences.
Okay. And The Martian. So The Martian has no aliens. It has no end of the world. But it is based on the Andy Weir book and has a lot of science behind it. I can't speak to the fact that it's probably not all 100% accurate science, but science is how they solve the problems. And he's left for dead on Mars. They thought he was deceased. They had to escape. And it turns out he survived and is able to kind of MacGyver his way through staying alive and existing on the planet. But it is so much about being on that planet that is so fascinating. And I think Mars, more than any of the big science fiction, expansive science fiction, is a planet we go back to again and again. You know, Edgar Rice Burroughs was writing about the Red Planet, the John Carter of Mars and the Princess of Mars. Even in It Came from Beneath the Sea, one of the scientists is named Dr. John Carter. So there's an interesting back and forth reference. So, but this is a Mars that is very believable, and a fight for survival that's actually very believable. And duct tape rocks. You know, you got to have duct tape whenever you travel, whether it's interplanetary or you know, across the country. Make sure you have a roll of duct tape. That's my word of advice from this film.
Yeah, and Debrah, I think you bring up a good point too, but this film feels so real, you know, like it's amazing. It's an amazing story, but also it felt so brought to life, you know, and like you felt like you were there, and that just brings it. It's so tangible in that way.
And it's Ridley Scott was the director too, which, considering that he did Aliens, Prometheus, all of those, which have incredible special effects and monsters, and mostly really bad acting and storytelling. This was really, really, The Martians were really good. The Martian was really good. So, The Expanse, what can I say? The proto-molecule, it creates, we're in a future where Mars is colonized and the asteroids are colonized, but there's definitely a hierarchy of haves and have-nots. But attention to detail in this is something that I really value, because what you find with the people that grew up and live on the asteroids and are doing the mining, and you know, they don't have good gravity, they don't have good environmental air, water, and you see these people that are long and tall, and they can't really, their physical structures can't survive very well on Earth. The way of speaking, the kind of tattoos, all of this, they create these cultures that are very, very believable, and a more militaristic, aggressive Mars. And, you know, so it's just, again, they're very thoughtful about the worlds that they created and how they make them look. And I really, really enjoyed that.
Yeah, enormous critical praise for the show. I mean, it really is at the cutting edge of the kind of television science fiction storytelling these days. Great acting, great, you know, great special effects, but also, again, that storytelling. It tells a really fascinating story. It's hard to, you know, it's addictive.
Altered Carbon.
Yeah.
For television, that it was it sort of reminded, I liked the first one better than the second season, I have to say, but I liked, mostly because the first season of Altered Carbon was not so much a love story. I mean, it was, but it was also about, again, the haves and the have-nots, the rich that could live in the floating cities, and the fact that people could live forever, not in their own bodies. They were just sleeves, as it turns out. But an alien technology allowed them to transfer their brains and keep going. And that kind of storyline was fascinating to me. So it just, and it was gritty, and it, you know, lots of planets, lots of periods of time, and people just didn't get nice. You know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in the future, we just don't get nicer. We get worse, I think. But
and for me, this is that summation of what we were talking about. I mean, like, the storytelling is great, the characters are great, it's super entertaining, but also, again, it tells a whole story. You know, it's not just, again, these little week by week episodes. This for me is when I've really felt finally in like the last, like the 2010s, most of all, like you're starting to finally see the thing that I was hoping for in live action science fiction, like I was seeing in Japanese animation almost 20 years ago, which is, you know, oh, like you can tell these stories. And it seems real, but also it's a compelling ongoing story. It's not just these little bits and pieces. I mean, we see that in Game of Thrones and other kinds of shows, but for science fiction to finally be able to achieve all that, to me, is a huge deal. And Altered Carbon is just a perfect example of that. Very engaging, very entertaining. And actually, this is one that Debrah recommended to me. I was kind of a little so-so on it. I wasn't sure if we should watch it, but Debrah really praised it, because Debrah and I talk all the time at work about science fiction when we have a break. And so she was mentioning that I should check this out. And so I did. And I'm really glad that I did, which leads to our final one we wanted to mention, also a Debrah recommendation.
Future Man. Oh, what can I say about Future Man? But
we're laughing because this show it's comedy. It's science fiction comedy, and it's also, by the way, for those of you who don't really like categorical humor, don't watch it. It's very childish. It's very much aimed towards the 23-year-old male, if you will. Although we're huge fans.
Yeah, but I liked it too. It's time travel and insecurities wrapped together, and it's an amazing storyline through all 3 seasons. And yeah, it is, you know, what can I say? We watch the serious stuff, but we also watch this, and some of the ideas that come into this story are truly outrageous, and especially the 3rd season.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, that like we're saying, like, we love great stories. We love, you know, to see these worlds that we enjoy brought to life. But this one also brings in a level of humor that you would never expect. And again, similarly, when I saw the ads for this, I was like, that looks terrible. It looks like something that's not for me. And Debrah, but the fact that Debrah liked it, I was like, maybe there's something more to it, and I was blown away. It's extremely funny. The great characters. I love
Well
the
done.
characters.
Yeah.
Well
Great
done.
characters.
Yeah, funny stories. So another just a quick recommendation. But again, if you don't like potty humor, be careful about watching it because it's pretty bad in that way. But we wanted to end on a fun one because we know that sometimes we talk about science fiction and it's post-apocalyptic and dour and whatnot. But this one is one that we really enjoy.
So that's all we have. If you have questions, we'd be happy to take them. I know we've taken a fair amount of your time, but we've also taken you to worlds beyond your imagination. And there's so many more films we could have talked about. So
Debrah and I are really deep into this, so thank you for bearing with us because this was a passion project for us to want to share this with all of you because it's easy for us to be at the museum and seem like we're just these kind of intellectual and academic types, and of course that's a big part of our job, but what really drives us is these passions, and you even see some of this reflected in the work we do at the museum. So
thank you both for sharing that with us. It was terrific. I've got a couple questions from our audience, and they are of a similar vein. Broadly starting, how would you define sci-fi? Would you consider King Kong to be sci-fi, Jurassic Park? And then somebody else, Nancy Postero asks, Battlestar Galactica? So
absolutely. Again, there's so many things we left out. And so we tried to go through and pick things that either spoke to each of our interests, but absolutely Battlestar Galactica, Lost in Space, which is awful, but it should be in there. And yeah, King Kong and all of those big kind of monster movies, Godzilla, again, we only had a certain amount of time. If you want to invite us back every week for the next, 6 or 7 months, we could certainly cover it all. One that I left out that I really like is Arrival. And that is one that's all about language and how language can rewire your brain and our thinking. But, and it's a fairly recent one about aliens coming to, is it 12 or 7 different locations around the world? Mm-hmm. And so yeah, there's so many more.
Yeah, I think that we tried to stick with like the pretty obviously like hard sci-fi, so like the obvious sci-fi stuff. But I think both Debrah and I's boundaries on it are fairly loose, especially because both of us have read a lot. And if you're in the world of reading some of these things, if you read a lot of science fiction literature, it really is it's really flexible, and it can tap into a lot of things, and I also think Debrah and I are very much into other kinds of genres that overlap with this, like you're hearing about Westerns and other things, I'm again, like Godzilla to me is definitely all those are science fiction films. Some of them are more obviously science fiction, they happen in space and stuff like that. Some of them, the original one doesn't seem as much so, but I'm a huge Godzilla fan. That's a Godzilla poster back there, by the way. I mean, I live in this is part of my life, and even where I live, and so it's hard for us to define it in that way, to draw the category around it. That's part even the reason we ended up with Future Man is it tends to be really a comedy that has science fiction, and so, but that's what's so fun is there's so much flexibility within that to tie all these ideas together.
That's great, and the questions are now rolling in. Any comments on, let me give you a couple of them and then maybe you can tie it all together in the response. Any comments on Farscape? I'm given suggestions about speculative fiction or the new genre of Afrofuturism like Black Panther. So let's start with Farscape and then we can move in.
So Farscape, there were concepts within Farscape that I really liked. The fact that the ship was a living creature. I found most of the acting a little cartoonish, but the video, I liked visually how it looked. And I enjoyed watching it, but it was really because of how they depicted the ship and its relationship. That's, to me, what was really, really strong. Did you ever watch Farscape, Joaquin?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I never got super deep into it, but I really enjoyed it. And also, it's related to Jim Henson. It was this Creature Workshop, or not the Creature Workshop, but the Jim Henson studio that did a lot of the puppet animations and things. And I'm a huge, not just animation, drawn animation, but, puppets like we were talking about. I mean, I love the Dark Crystal. And so, like, for me, there was a big draw on that. But I think sometimes the story didn't, like, engage me as much as I wanted to. I have been meaning to go back and rewatch it because I felt like sometimes with our ability now to binge on shows, which isn't always the healthiest thing, but sometimes I feel like I get a lot more out of it. As a side note to that, actually, I was never a huge fan of Star Trek Deep Space Nine when I was at that age. When it was on, I thought it was okay, but I really couldn't follow it, and I didn't watch it enough. I went back and watched it as an adult, and I was blown away by being able to watch it episode by episode and see all the richness and nuance of the storytelling. And it was a huge influence on Battlestar Galactica that somebody brought up recently. That some of the showrunners from that ended up working on Battlestar Galactica, and it has a lot of the same themes about humanity and what war does to us and all those sort of things. So, I mean, all those kind of ideas are tied together. That was an interesting period too, where again, like some of what we're talking about, like how do you show that thing? Well, you make a puppet, like Yoda, or like in 1970, 79 or 80. It's so, but Farscape never like clicked as much with me, but I hope to someday check it out again because now we have so much access to all these things. Debrah was telling me that she rewatched Quintet.
Well, actually, I own it online because
Yeah.
I counted. I collect science fiction films. I download them and, the ones I pay for.
Yeah.
And I have at least 84 different science fiction films. But Black Panther, there were things. So Black Panther was great because of the cast and the approach. And I love Wakanda. I mean, that's the kind of future we wish really existed. But what I like about a lot of modern science fiction is that the casts are so integrated now. Like if you looked at both of Altered Carbon, the second Altered Carbon was the main characters were predominantly Black. And then in the first one, he's slipping through these different skins from his original one was of an Asian ethnicity into, his sort of Scandinavian character. But I think that, Black Panther is up there with, it's like the Marvel, it's all that Marvel stuff. So it's much more comic book. And I tend not to be as interested in the comic book stuff as I am in things like The Road, which is dark, apocalyptic. And it's, I do like Guardians of the Galaxy because of the music and, it's an adventure. But the serious kind of darker films are much more to my taste. Do you have more questions, Ryan?
Well, I was
there
going to say, actually,
more.
to follow up on the Afrofuturism stuff. I mean, I've been into Afrofuturism for a very long time. In college, actually, I ended up spending a lot of time trying to find ways to study science fiction academically and took some interesting classes around it and stuff. And Afrofuturism was heavily being talked about at that time. And so I collect some of those writers, but you haven't seen that expand as much within the film and TV worlds as much yet. And there's a lot of really interesting ideas that are happening there that weren't brought up. And actually this relates back to my music passion also. There's a lot of that actually being sourced into music at the time. Late 1970s funk and stuff like that was heavily sci-fi oriented, Parliament Funkadelic and Sun Ra and things like that. And so I love Afrofuturism, and I liked Black Panther more so than a lot of the other Marvel movies I'd seen, just because it brought in a lot of those ideas and it was exciting to me. I'm really excited about where the Marvel movies are going because they're getting more science fiction-y. I love Thor Ragnarok. I thought that was amazing, and also that's by a director.
But that's because the director,
Yeah, Debrah and I love that director, Taika Waititi. Like, he's just amazing, and his work is always humorous and has great characters, and they're really rich and they're really exciting and they really grab your attention, but they're also visually just fascinating movies, whatever he does, whether it's a smaller comedy drama sort of thing or something like that. But even coming back to the genres thing, I mean, Marvel movies are science fiction in a lot of ways, I don't think that maybe Debrah and I are as passionate about those, but I watch a lot of them when they're around, and I check them out. So and we could do a whole separate talk, which we're not trying to pitch more talks, but about just how all that stuff kind of gets played out, because there's so much of that happening now, and so much of that has to do with this, again, great storytelling, because there's been some great stories in comic books that were never really shared, but now also the special effects can keep up and bring those things to life. I mean, Guardians of the Galaxy, those movies are highly entertainment, but they're beautiful to watch. They're amazingly visual.
And the other thing I was going to say, you talked about music in one of the animes that were really important. The Martian are playing, the music is a disco music that was left by his female captain of the whole trip. And so music is a really big part of that film. And I just want to emphasize something else that you said. The Afrocentricism, sorry, it's getting past my bedtime, is in writing. The science, it's a whole crop of new writers are producing some pretty interesting books. And there's a sense of sort of mystical realism with the storylines and kind of more of the powers that these individuals have in kind of a depressed future. So some more questions, Ryan.
We have time for two more.
Okay.
Jamie Walker asks, who is your favorite sci-fi writer?
I will freely acknowledge, I think Debrah and I both struggle with the problem of choosing one favorite is really hard for us. I will mention one that I really love in relation to Afrofuturism and those things is Samuel Delany. He has this very classic novel called Dahlgren, which is like it's very heady. It's very hard to read. I don't recommend just picking it up. It's like the Ulysses of science fiction. But he was very influential on me more recently in terms of thinking about some of these new ideas and some of that stuff.
I'm trying to remember the name right off the top of my head, but the person that wrote the story that Arrival is based on, is it Ted Lieu?
Yeah, something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head.
And he is, his writing is gorgeous, but I have to say, I'll read anything. I mean, I've read all of Edgar Rice Burroughs at a very young age. And so it just, whatever's out there, I'll read, and if it's good, it's great, and if it's bad, it's okay. But I don't have one single writer that I would say is the best. But The Road as a movie, but the book that it's based on is extremely. They're the closest that I've ever come across from a book translating into a film, and so that's pretty powerful.
I'm going to work with Joaquin and Debrah after this to compile a little list of films and books that have been mentioned tonight. It takes us a little time to get it together in the office, but we'll be able to send it out to everybody, along with a link to tonight's event that we can post on YouTube afterwards. So there'll be some reference points there for you. I know that Sandra Silverstein had a question or comment. Sandra is a long-standing member of our film selection committee, long-standing and in good standing. Sandra.
And hello to Sandra. We know Sandra and we love Sandra.
Yeah, I've spent the whole day out at introducing movies out at MOPA. I always grab that assignment, but I'm not a real big science fiction fan, but I was married to somebody for 50 years who was really a big science fiction fan. But in terms that this is a program of the Center for Jewish Culture, I would like to mention the name of my favorite science fiction story, which was, Boy, Do We Have a Rabbi on Venus.
Never heard that.
You never, no, it's, oh my gosh, it must be, well, I read it in maybe like the early 90s, so
yeah.
Okay.
Around. But it's published online by the Tablet magazine, if you
Great.
And I mean, it is a Center for Jewish Culture. And I just enjoyed this. I'm thinking of reading Asimov. I only have read the old guys,
Yeah, but they're good. I mean, Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and, the worlds that they created were what I think what lead to a sense of wonder and adventure. You know, if you grow up with science fiction, you're much more open to the odd stuff in the world. I mean, it makes it really exciting. And
haven't you lost interest in apocalyptic fiction? Because I think we're living in the apocalypse.
Well, yeah, but we're living in but that's a whole different genre, which is kind of the viral thing. And there are movies and there are books that are based on that. There's a lot of books out now on the electromagnetic pulse that takes out everything, and you know how you have to. And then we haven't even gone into zombies. So I mean, you know, I'm not a big zombie person, but there's a few out there. Or vampires.
Vampires. Well.
Yeah, so, I love how all these genres interconnect, by the way, and they can be really fun. But yeah, and you know, I think just to mention real quick, I mean, part of the reason that some of you who are familiar with the museum see that we are always changing is because Debrah and I are futurists. Like we're not so, the past influences us, where we both love history and we read all the time and we want to know those things. But Debrah and I always we want to be part of creating the future. And I think a lot of that comes from us growing up reading these things, you know, and not just the adventure and fun stuff, but also the highly intellectual stuff. I mean, you know, that drives, I know a lot of what I see with Debrah is she wants to engage with ideas. I want to engage with ideas, you know, that's because that's what we grew up engaging with. And we also wanted to see that happening in the films and TV we're exposed to. And today it's like, it's better than it's ever been before.
There are 2 points I want to get to before we wind down, and both came, Joaquin and Debrah, from the conversation that we had last week. Each of you had mentioned a Jewish sci-fi either writer or director. Did we touch upon their work tonight?
I didn't touch upon with mine because I didn't want to be overly, you know, tokenish, if you will, you know, because that's a big part of what I do in my job as well. But you know, I mentioned the kind of early thing that turned me into a fan of, you know, animation, especially more like adult-oriented animation, was Ralph Bakshi. And while I was doing my research on this, just to kind of, you know, get familiar again, I was looking into his background, and I didn't realize he was Jewish. Had no idea. But in hindsight, it makes sense because that film is all about the effects of World War II. And the kind of core narrative, because I didn't really want to over-explain any of these movies, but it is all about, like, essentially in the future, after an apocalypse, these wizards, these mutant wizards, and one of the evil one finds the Third Reich propaganda films and uses them to train all these other mutants into becoming, you know, a new Nazi era, if you will, you know. So, and at the time that was completely over my head. I was like 8 when I saw it, but when I rewatched it as an adult, I was like, oh man, that's what this is about. But I had no idea that he had that background, and that he was probably talking a lot about what was going on, what had happened with his family and other things, you know. So yeah, more to be done there, more research for me.
And then Jerry Anderson, who did the Fireball XL5 and Thunderbirds, was Jewish and living in London. So, but again, you know, I know that I look at these more as, you know, what the film is as, and a little bit less that, you know, what their background may be. But I think it does, you know, it makes for interesting thought when we look at these things.
Yeah, in some ways, I mean, for us, a lot of what brings that together is like, I mean, I think that science fiction has always culturally been a place where people who feel like outsiders can kind of come together, you know? And so it's not surprising when you engage in science fiction communities that they come from very diverse backgrounds, you know? So I think that's some of why that happens, is because it's a way of thinking about the world in a different way and getting us to reflect about what's happening today, but through a different lens.
Yeah. And just in my defense, I've never been to Comic-Con. And I don't dress up and role play. It's about the ideas, and it really is about the ideas.
Jackie, do you have a question out there? See you raising your hand.
No, it's not a question, but it's a very short story. Can I say it?
Please, yeah, sure.
Okay. And Sandra Silverstein already knows it. But I was working at the JCC a number of years ago, and we were producing the Streisand Festival of New Jewish Plays. That means they were reading plays that we were as you can hear, I have a French accent, okay? But I am in my office, the phone rings, and I pick up the phone, and somebody says, you know, I would love to participate and do some reading at your festival. And I say, oh, with pleasure, sir. And what do you do exactly? That means I explained that I'm trying to make the story short. And the gentleman says, yes, I would like really to come. And say, can I have your name? And he say, Leonard Nimoy. I say,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, sir. And he say, Leonard Nimoy. And I say, would you spell your last name for me? He said, you want me to spell my last name to you? And I say, if you don't mind, sir, I don't want to make a spelling mistake. And he said, have you ever heard about Star Trek? Star Trek? No. Or that on the phone. And say, have you heard about Mr. Spock? I say, no. And I'm calling you to tell you that I want to be on your LFJCC program. Buff. He hung up. My boss come, Lynette Allen, and she said, and I said, you know, a guy called, he was very upset about, what's his name, Leonard Nimoy? I said, what did you say? I said, spell out your name. And she said, you deserve to be fired. I said, look, I am from Tunisia, I'm French, you hire me to do a book fair, it's not my problem.
Yeah.
But she was not happy. 2 years later, talking about Jewish identity, he did a beautiful book, a photograph on his wife, Shekhinah, which is the divine presence of God in the feminine approach. And it was a beautiful book. And I say, I have to call him now. I know who he is and come to the book fair. That means I call his number and I say, Mr. Nimoy, he said, you are the lady to talk to me 2 years ago. I say, yes, please don't hang up. I say, what now? I say,
a lot of people don't realize he was a very passionate and accomplished photographer as well.
Yeah.
Right. The book is magnificent.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, yeah, I recognize your voice. And I said, please don't hang up. He said, what do you want now? I said, now I want you to come to the book fair. He said, you didn't let me enter the Streisand Festival of Plays, and now you want, I say, yes, sir. And I don't know what he does. And he said, I'm coming. And he came.
That's amazing. Jacqueline, thank you for sharing that. That's so amazing.
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to follow that one up. I know better.
I know.
I'm sorry.
I think we'll tie a bow in the
you
evening.
started to talk about Judaism, Jewish identity, but look at the book if you didn't see it, Shekhinah. And Sandra followed that with me, Sandra Silverstein. Anyway, sorry.
There we go. We're hitting the late night with Jacqueline Gamache.
Thank you.
Debrah and Joaquin, thank you both very much. This was an enjoyable evening, and I think there's a lot more we could do in the future too, which is exciting.
Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.